For 9 years, Terrell Brooks drove a Cleveland cab through the part of the night most people slept through, and when a fare couldn't pay, he let the meter sit dark at 0 and drove them home anyway. He never told anyone. He never wrote it down. The car was a 2009 Crown Victoria with 311,000 miles and a crack in the dash he had patched with electrical tape 4 winters back. The only thing about that cab he was proud of. 72 hours after a wet Tuesday in March, a man who owned the largest hospital network in the county, worth somewhere north of $400 million, sat watching 9 seconds of grainy footage of that cab. Terrell never noticed the television camera. He had no idea the man on the other end of it had spent 36 years arranging his fortune so he would never have to answer one question. What Terrell did with the meter dark would either force that question into the open at last or prove the man right to have buried it. Terrell Brooks was 54 years old, and he had been driving for hire in some form since he was 22. He started in a delivery van, moved to a parcel route, lost the route when the company folded in 2008, and bought into the cab in 2014. With $6,200 he had saved across 11 months in a coffee can his grandmother had used for the same purpose her whole life. The can still sat on the shelf above his stove, empty now except for 2 buttons and a 1974 Kennedy $50 his grandmother had told him never to spend. He lived alone in a rented half of a double on East 116th, 4 rooms upstairs over an empty lower unit the landlord never could keep filled. Rent was $640 a month. He paid it on the 3rd of every month in person, in cash, because he didn't trust the mail with anything that mattered, and he counted out the bills on the landlord's porch in the same order every time. 400s, 220s, 410s, the change. The landlord, an old Polish man named Mr. Cinco, who'd held the deed since 1971, always said the same thing back. "You're the only one who pays me in daylight, Terrell." And Terrell always said the same thing. Daylight's free. His nights started at 8:40. When he carried his thermos and his lunch down the back stairs in the dark. The thermos was steel, dented on one side, and he filled it with coffee and exactly 2 sugars, because his doctor at the free clinic on Quincy had told him in 2021 that his A1C was 6.4 and he needed to cut it to 1 sugar, and Terrell had compromised at 2 and not told her. The lunch was a cast iron skillet's worth of whatever he'd cooked Sunday, packed cold into a margarine tub. Cornbread. Sometimes collard greens with smoked turkey instead of pork because the pork was $5.49 a pound now, and the turkey necks were 2.10 cents. Sometimes just beans and rice. He ate it at 1 a.m. in a parking lot off Buckeye, with the engine running for the heat, listening to a gospel station that signed off at 2. The cab's gas tank held 19 gallons. At the 10 a gallon, a full tank ran him $77.90, and he could do 2 full nights on a tank if he didn't run the heat too hard. On a good night he cleared $104 after gas. On a bad night he cleared 4. He kept the math in his head the way some men keep a song, always running underneath everything. 9 fares to break even, 12 to make rent, 15 to put anything in the can. A night ran a shape. At 9:05 he'd pick up the cooks and dishwashers coming off the dinner shift downtown. $11 to $14 fares, 3 or 4 of them before 10. Men and women too tired to talk, smelling of fryer grease and bleach. At 10:30 the bars on Buckeye started feeding him $7 and $8 hops, 2 miles or less, 8 or 9 of them between 10:30 and midnight on a Friday. The middle of the night, midnight to 4, was when the real city showed itself. The home health aide getting off a double, the dialysis patient, the man walking to a 3rd shift job at the bakery on Woodland because the bus didn't run, the woman who cleaned the very towers where men like Theodore Banks made the decisions that closed her clinic. Terrell carried all of them. And somewhere in those hours, 2 or 3 nights a week, he carried the ones the meter never counted. There was a man he called Pop, though he never learned his real name, who slept in the doorway of a shuttered furniture store on Union, and once a week around 2 a.m. would flag Terrell down and ride 4 blocks to the all-night gas station where the bathroom had no lock, and the clerk let him wash up before the day people came. The ride was 40 cents on the meter if Terrell had run it. He never ran it. He'd wait the 8 or 9 minutes in the lot with the heat on, and drive Pop back, and Pop always said the same thing climbing out. "You a good man, Terrell." And Terrell always said, "Get some rest, Pop," because his grandmother had taught him you never agree when somebody calls you good. You just turn it back toward them. There was a girl, maybe 19. He'd picked up 4 separate nights that winter outside the same motel on Carnegie, and he had never once asked her a question because he knew what the motel was, and he knew that a question was a kind of judgment with a question mark stuck on the end. He just drove her where she said and left the meter dark and told her, the 4th time, the only personal thing he ever told her, which was that the corner store on Union opened at 6, and the woman who ran it would give her a coffee for $1 and not look at her funny. The girl had started crying in the back seat, quiet, and Terrell had kept his eyes on the road to give her the privacy of his not seeing. And at the end she'd tried to give him $5 she did not have, and he'd folded it back into her hand and said, "We're good," and pulled off. He knew the East Side the way you know a face you've loved a long time. He knew that the light at Kinsman and East 93rd stayed red for 91 seconds, and that the woman who ran the corner store on Union opened at 6 a.m. sharp and would slide you a coffee for $1 if you were a regular and looked tired enough. He knew which churches let the heat run all night so the old folks who couldn't pay their gas bills could sit in the back pews. And he knew the basement door at Greater Mount Pilgrim was unlocked on the cold nights because Deacon Ruffin, who was 81, believed a church that locked out the cold wasn't a church. Terrell had driven Deacon Ruffin to dialysis 3 times that winter and never started the meter once. That was the part nobody saw. The meter was a small black box on the dash, and when Terrell pressed the worn rubber button, it lit up and started counting at 3.50 cents and added 40 cents every eighth of a mile. When he didn't press it, it sat dark. He had a system he had never explained to a living soul, because explaining it would have ruined it. If a fare flagged him down and he could see in the first 10 seconds that they were carrying their whole life in 2 plastic bags, or that they were a girl who had been crying, or a man in a thin coat at 3 a.m., who kept saying he only needed to go just up the way. Terrell left the button alone. He drove them. At the end he'd say, "We're good," and pull off before they could argue, and the meter, the whole ride, would have stayed at town. He did not think of it as charity. He would have been embarrassed by the word. He thought of it the way his grandmother had taught him to think of it, which was not as a thing you did but as a thing you simply were, the way you were tall or left-handed. His grandmother's name was Ola Brooks, and she had come up from Greene County, Alabama, in 1953 on a bus that took 2 days, carrying a cardboard suitcase and a cast-iron skillet wrapped in a church dress so it wouldn't bang. She had cleaned other people's houses in Shaker Heights for 31 years, raised Terrell after his mother got sick, and died in 1999 in the back bedroom of the house on East 116th, in the bed Terrell still slept in. She used to say a thing at the kitchen table, slow, the way she said everything, with her hands flat on the wood. She'd say, "Baby, you don't get paid for the good you do in the dark. That's how you know it's real." And then she'd say the second half, which was the half that cost something, the half Terrell carried like a stone in his coat. "But you do it anyway. You hear me? You do it anyway, or you ain't got nothing to give nobody, not even yourself." She had a scripture card she kept tucked in the frame of the mirror by the door, a little card from a 1968 revival, the print faded to almost nothing, Matthew on one side and a watercolor lily on the other. After she died, Terrell taped it to the dash of the cab, just below the meter, where the morning sun hit it. By 2023 the watercolor had bleached white and you could only make out 3 words of the verse, but Terrell knew the rest by heart and didn't need them printed. He looked at the card more than he looked at the meter. He had been married once, to a woman named Carla, from 1996 to 2004. They'd wanted children and it hadn't come, and the not coming had worn a groove in both of them that they finally fell into and couldn't climb out of. Carla lived in Columbus now, remarried, and they'd parted with no cruelty, which Terrell counted as a kind of mercy. He kept one photograph of her on the visor of the cab, clipped beside a photograph of Ola at the church anniversary in 1991, both women in their good hats. When the visor was up, the two of them looked down at the empty passenger seat all night long. People who rode in his cab assumed he was a quiet man. He let them assume it. He talked when they wanted to talk and stayed silent when they didn't, and he had learned over 30 years to tell the difference inside the first block. He had heard, in that front seat, more truth than a priest. Men told him things at 4 a.m. they had never told their wives. A woman once cried the whole way from the county hospital to her apartment in Slavic Village and said, at the door, "You're the first person who let me." He had nodded and said, "Yes, ma'am," and pulled off, and the meter had stayed at $N, and he had thought about her for a week. On Sundays, when he didn't drive, Terrell went to the 11 o'clock service at Greater Mount Pilgrim, in the third pew from the back on the left, where Ola had always sat because she said the front pews were for people who needed God to see them, and the back pews were for people who'd already been seen. After service, he'd go down to the basement, where the women ran the after-church plates, $7 for chicken or fish, sides included, the money going to the heating fund, and he'd eat at a folding table with the old men and let Deacon Ruffin, who was 81 and had buried his wife of 53 years that spring, tell him the same 3 stories about Alabama he told every week. Terrell had heard the stories more than 100 times. He listened like it was the first every time, because Ola had taught him that the only gift you can give an old man is to let him be the one with something to say. It was Deacon Ruffin he drove to dialysis on the cold nights, when the deacon's grandson couldn't get off work, 3 times that winter. The trip out to the center on East 105th and the long wait and the trip back. 4 hours start to finish, the meter dark the whole time. The deacon tried to pay him every time with a $20 bill folded into a square the size of a stamp, and Terrell took it exactly once. The first time, because he understood that a man who has lost everything needs to be allowed to give something, and then he slipped it into the church heating fund jar on his way out. So the gift went where the deacon would have wanted it anyway. His own body was starting to send him bills he couldn't fold back into anyone's hand. The free clinic on Quincy had told him his blood pressure was a 148/02 in 2021 and his A1C was 6.4, and the nurse practitioner there, a young woman named Ms. Okafor who saw 40 patients a day and seemed to remember all of them, had written him a prescription he filled when he could and skipped when rent was close. He was supposed to come back every 3 months. He came back every 5 or 6. He knew what diabetes did to a man's feet and a man's eyes, because he had watched it take Ola's sight in her last 2 years. And he was afraid of it the way you are afraid of a road you have seen swallow someone. But fear cost nothing and a copay cost $40, so the fear won most months, and he drove on his 2 sugars and his bad nights and told himself he would see Miss Okafor in the spring. What he never told anyone was the count. He didn't keep a count on purpose because Ola's voice in his head told him a count was just a different way of asking to get paid. But if he had kept one, across 9 years, the rides he gave for free would have run into the hundreds. He drove a $400 million city's poorest people through its longest nights for nothing, dozens of times a month, and the only record of it anywhere on earth was a small dark box that said Dollins, and a faded card that said 3 words of a verse about the least of these. He was tired in a way that had stopped being a feeling and become a fact, like his height. But he was not bitter. Bitterness, Ola used to say, was just grief that had given up. Terrell had not given up, he just drove. Theodore Banks was 71 years old, and on the same Tuesday that Terrell Brooks was nursing a dying set of wipers through the rain, Banks was standing on the 44th floor of a tower downtown, looking at a model of a building that did not exist yet, and feeling nothing. The building was a $190 million surgical pavilion, the 9th major facility in the Banks Regional Health Network, and the architectural model on the table in front of him was worth $40,000 by itself and had taken a firm in Chicago 5 months to build. It had tiny lit windows and a tiny atrium with a tiny tree. Banks looked at the tiny tree and thought about the maintenance contract. He had built the network from a single storefront clinic he'd opened in 1989 on Cedar Avenue with a $38,000 loan he'd asked 3 banks for before the 4th said yes. The clinic had 12 folding chairs and 1 exam room. Now Banks Regional had 4 hospitals, 1,140 beds, 2 surgical centers, 19 outpatient sites, 11,000 employees, and a marble lobby in the flagship hospital on Carnegie with his name cut into the wall in letters 18 inches high. He had been on the cover of the business magazine twice. He gave the commencement address at his old high school every other year and told the graduates that the world owed them nothing and that this was the best news they would ever get. He had come up out of Huff. He was 13 in July of 1966 when the Hovrites burned 6 nights of his childhood to the foundations, and he remembered standing on Huff Avenue at dawn on the 4th morning, watching the smoke go straight up because there was no wind, and deciding, with the cold clarity that only a 13-year-old can manage, that he was never going to be a man things happened to. He was going to be a man who built the things, so that he was the one who decided whether they stood or fell. He had kept that promise with a ferocity that frightened people. His own board was afraid of him. He had buried 2 of the men who started the company with him and had not cried at either funeral, and people noticed that, and it became part of how they spoke of him, cold, exact, untouchable. He did not mind. Untouchable was the whole point. What none of them knew, not the board, not the magazines, not the 11,000 people whose paychecks said his name, was Eleanor. He had married Eleanor in 1981. She taught 2nd grade at a school on East 79th, and she was the only person who had ever made Theodore Banks laugh in a way he couldn't control. In the fall of 1987, when the clinic on Cedar was 2 years old and drowning in debt, and Banks was working 90 hours a week to keep it from closing, Eleanor got pregnant. She was 34. It was a hard pregnancy from the start, and the doctors at the clinic, his clinic, were good people working with nothing, and on a night in February of 1988, Eleanor went into labor early and wrong, and the bleeding started, and the one ambulance that served their part of the east side that night was 40 minutes out on a call in Glenville. Banks drove her himself. He carried her down the steps of the apartment on Quincy and put her in the back seat of a brown Buick and drove the 2 1/3 miles to the nearest hospital that would take her, which was not his clinic because his clinic couldn't handle it, running every light, and it was not far enough or fast enough. And Eleanor died at 4:11 in the morning, and the baby, a girl, died at 4:26. He had named her. On the death certificate, in his own hand, in the space for the child's name, he had written Grace. He told no one her name. He told no one most of it. What he did instead, starting the week of the double funeral, was build. He stopped sleeping and he built. He decided with the same cold clarity he'd found on Huff Avenue at 13, that the reason Eleanor died was not God and not chance and not the ambulance driver doing 80 in the rain across town. The reason was that the system had failed, and a system could be fixed, and he was going to fix it so completely that no woman on the east side of Cleveland would ever again die 2 1/3 miles from help because the help was 40 minutes away. He built 4 hospitals. He cut the average ambulance response time in his coverage area from 19 minutes to 8. He was, by any measure anyone could name, a man who had turned the worst night of his life into the salvation of thousands of strangers. The local foundation had given him a humanitarian award in 2016, and he had accepted it in a tuxedo and said the right things and gone home to an empty house in Bracknell and stood in his kitchen at midnight. And felt the same nothing he felt looking at the tiny tree. Because somewhere in 36 years of building the system, he had come to believe a thing that he repeated so often it had worn smooth, like a stone in a river. He said it to his board, to reporters, to the graduating seniors. He said it whenever anyone praised an act of individual kindness, a nurse who'd stayed late, a donor who'd written a check. He would tip his head slightly and say, in the flat voice that ended discussions, "The system is the kindness, people fail, systems don't." He believed it because the alternative was unbearable. The alternative was that on a February night in 1988 it had not been the system that failed Eleanor. It had been him, driving a brown Buick 2 1/3 miles too slow, a man and not a system, and no amount of marble could fix a man. So he had stopped being a man, as much as a living person can. He had become a system, and it had worked in the sense that systems work. The response times came down, the buildings went up. His name got 18 inches tall on a wall. He had not turned on a meter, so to speak, for a single human being in 36 years. He gave it scale, or he did not at all. He would have told you and believed it. That scale was the higher form of love. That the man who saves one stranger in the rain is sentimental, and the man who saves 9,000 strangers with a logistic model is serious, and that the world confused the two only because it preferred to feel something, rather than to fix something. On that Tuesday in March, on the 44th floor, Banks looked at the tiny lit tree in the model of the building that didn't exist, and his assistant told him the news crew was downstairs to do the segment on the Cedar Avenue Clinic anniversary, and he said, "Tell them I'll come down." And he did not yet know that in 72 hours a small dark box that said 0 was going to do to him what marble never could. The rain on that Tuesday started at 6 p.m. and was still coming at 11:40, when Renee Carter walked out of the laundromat on Kinsman with a basket on her hip and her water already broken 20 minutes before, though she had told herself it was something else. She was 23. She was 8 months and 1 week along, and she was alone in the way that the city makes some people alone, which is not the same as being unloved but is its own cold thing. Her mother was in Atlanta. The baby's father had left in November. She had a phone with $4 of credit on a prepaid plan and a bus pass that didn't run that route after the and when the contractions stopped pretending to be anything else and folded her over the top of a parked car at 11:44. She did the math that poor people do, the same math Terrell ran all night, and the math said, an ambulance is a bill I can't pay, and a bill I can't pay is a thing they take from a baby I don't have yet. So she stood at the curb in the rain, soaked through, holding her belly with both arms, and she lifted one hand at the headlights coming down Kinsman the way you lift a hand to a wave you're not sure will see you. Terrell saw her from a block off. He had been driving for 30 years and he could read a body at 40 feet, and the body at the curb said, "This is bad now, not this is bad soon." He pulled to the curb so smooth the basket of wet clothes didn't even slide off the trunk where she'd set it, and he had the back door open before she finished the first word. "I can't pay," she said. It was the first thing she said. Not "help me," not the hospital. She said the true thing first because she was her mother's daughter and you led with the truth. Terrell did not press the meter button. The small black box stayed dark at $0, and it would stay dark for the next 11 minutes. And that was the whole story, though no one watching would understand it for 3 more days. "Get in," he said. "We're going. Hold my eyes, not the clock." He left the laundry basket on the wet trunk. He would think about that later, the basket of somebody's clean clothes sitting in the rain on the back of his cab the whole way, and how nobody ever thinks about the laundry in the worst moment of their life, and how that, somehow, was the detail that broke him. The nearest hospital that could take her was the flagship on Carnegie, the one with the marble lobby and the 18-inch name, 2 3/10 of a mile from the laundromat on Kinsman. Terrell did not know whose name was on the wall. He knew the route. He took Kinsman to East 79th and ran the long downhill where he knew the lights, talking the whole way in the low, even voice he used on the worst nights, not because he had anything to say, but because his grandmother had taught him that a frightened person in the dark needs a voice, the way a drowning person needs a rail. You breathe out longer than you breathe in, he told her. That's the trick, out longer than in. My grandmother delivered 4 babies in a kitchen in Alabama, and she said the breathing's the whole thing, out longer than in. There you go, there you go. Renee got his eyes in the mirror and held them. She breathed out longer than in. She did not look at the dark meter, because she did not know to, but somewhere in the worst 11 minutes of her life she registered that the little black box wasn't lit, and a part of her that would not surface until much later understood that the man driving her was not charging her, was not ever going to charge her, was going to act for the rest of this night as if the question of money had simply never been invented. He took the last turn into the ambulance bay of the hospital on Carnegie at 11:58, 11 minutes after he'd opened the door for her on Kinsman, and the great glass entrance threw its white light out across the wet pavement, and Terrell laid on the horn twice, short. The way you call for help without calling it panic. 2 people in scrubs came out fast with a wheelchair. Renee was gripping the door handle and the seat back and saying, "It's coming, it's coming." And Terrell came around and got an arm under her and walked her the 8 steps to the chair with his hand flat between her shoulder blades. The way you step something you are afraid to drop, and then she was in the chair and they were turning her toward the doors. She twisted around to look back at him. Her face under the white light was 23 years old and soaked and terrified and trying, even then, to be polite. "I don't even know your name," she said. "I can't pay you, I have to pay you." Terrell stood in the ambulance bay in the rain, with the engine still running behind him and the wipers still going against nothing, and for a moment, maybe 5 seconds, maybe 7, he did not move at all. He had stood still like that exactly twice before in his life that he could remember, both times at gravesides. He stood still now because of the laundry. He had just seen, in the white light, the basket of her clean clothes still sitting on the trunk of his cab where she'd set it 40 minutes ago. Soaked through now, ruined, somebody's whole week of clean clothes rained to nothing while she fought to get her child into the world. And the smallness of it, the way nobody on earth thinks about the laundry in the worst hour of their life, went through him like a blade. Then he did the only thing he knew how to do. He smiled at her, the easy smile he gave the back seat at nights the worst nights, and he said, "You don't owe me a thing, baby. You just had a hard ride to an easy place. Go have that, baby." And before she could say another word, before the thanks could land on him and turn what he'd done into a transaction, he got back in the cab and pulled out of the bay, the meter dark at $0 all the way to the street, and he did not look back, because Ola had taught him that you don't stay to be thanked. Staying to be thanked, she said, is just charging by a different name. He drove 4 blocks and pulled over on a dark stretch of cedar and put the car in park and sat with both hands on the wheel and breathed out longer than in, the way he'd told her to, until his own hands stopped shaking. Then he wiped the windshield with his sleeve and went back to work. He had 9 fares to break even, and the night was half gone. What Terrell did not know, what he could not have known, was that 40 yards behind them on Kinsman, at the very moment Renee got into his cab, a 4-person crew from the local evening news was packing a camera into the back of a van. They had been on Kinsman since 9, shooting B-roll for a feature airing Thursday about the closing of an East Side urgent care, the 3rd clinic to close in the area in 2 years. They had a tripod set up under the laundromat awning to stay out of the rain, the camera still rolling on a wide shot of the wet empty street, because the young photographer, a 26-year-old named Marcus who'd been doing this for 14 months, had learned to keep rolling on empty streets at night because empty streets at night sometimes filled up. The camera, on its own, with no one watching the viewfinder, recorded 9 seconds. It recorded a pregnant woman bent over a parked car in the rain. It recorded a battered Crown Victoria pulling to the curb. It recorded a man getting out and opening a door, and a basket of laundry sitting on the trunk in the rain. And it recorded the cab pulling off down Kinsman. And it recorded that for the entire 9 seconds the meter on the dash, just visible through the windshield in the streetlight, never lit up. The reporter on the crew was named Nia Coleman. She was 29. She had wanted, since she was a girl in Garfield Heights, to do journalism that mattered, and she had spent 14 months instead doing weather cut-ins and ribbon cuttings and 3 clinic closings features that aired at 6 and were forgotten by 7. She did not see the cab pull off. She was in the van on the phone with the desk, arguing about whether the clinic feature even had a hook. It would be 3 days before anyone scrubbed back through the B-roll and froze on those 9 seconds. It would be 3 days before Nia Coleman leaned close to a monitor and saw the dark meter, and understood what she was looking at, and asked the question that would set all of it moving. Why isn't the meter on? Renee Carter's daughter was born at 1:52 in the morning, 7 pounds 1 ounce, in a delivery room on the 4th floor of the flagship hospital on Carnegie, 2 3/10 of a mile from the laundromat where her mother's water had broken. The nurse who caught her was named Patrice and had worked that floor for 19 years. The room had a window that looked east and a clock and a wall, and none of the people in it that night had any reason to know that the man whose name was cut 18 inches high into the marble downstairs had driven his own wife 2 1/3 miles along nearly the same streets 36 years before, and lost her, and lost the daughter she was carrying, and named that daughter Grace on a certificate he had never shown anyone. Renee did not know whose hospital it was. She would not have cared. She held her daughter against her chest at 2:20 in the morning, and could not stop crying, not from pain, the pain was over, but from the simple unbearable fact of having been carried. Somewhere in the long hours before dawn, a nurse asked if there was anyone they should call, and Renee said no, there was no one, and then she said the only thing she could think to give the world in return for what it had given her, which was, "There was a cab driver, I never got his name, he didn't charge me." Somebody should know that a man did that, and the nurse wrote nothing down, because there was no form for it, and the night moved on. Theodore Banks had been in that building 11 times in the past month. He walked through that marble lobby under his own name, past the same security desk and the same potted ficus and the same donor wall, and he had walked past the elevator bank that went up to the 4th floor delivery rooms more times than anyone could count, and he had never once gone up. He had a rule about the maternity floor that his executive assistant of 14 years knew without being told. They scheduled around it. In 36 years of owning hospitals, Theodore Banks had never set foot on a maternity ward. He told himself it was efficiency. The truth had a window and a clock and a wall in it, and her name was Grace, and he kept 3 floors and 36 years between himself and the place where babies are born for the same reason a man keeps his hand off a stove he has already been burned by, and 44 floors above the marble lobby of the hospital where Renee Carter's daughter had just been born at 1:52 that morning. A man who had decided 36 years ago that people fail, and systems don't, was about to be shown 9 seconds of proof that he had it exactly backward and had built $400 million of marble to keep from finding out. But that was 3 days off. On Kinsman, in the rain, none of them knew the others existed. Terrell drove the long downhill with the meter dark and his grandmother's card bleached white on the dash, and a stranger breathing out longer than in behind him. Banks slept badly in Bracknell, as he had for 36 years. The camera under the awning kept rolling on the empty street, and 3 lives that had been 2 1/3 miles apart their whole time in the same city moved without one of them knowing it toward the same marble wall. The segment aired that Friday at 6:14 in the evening, 90 seconds long, the 3rd story after a zoning fight and a weather tease. Nia Coleman had fought for it. She had taken the 9 seconds of B-roll to her news director, a man named Hollis, who had been doing this for 31 years and believed in nothing, and she had not led with the closing clinic. She had led with the meter. "Watch the dash," she'd said, and run it back 4 times, and the 4th time even Hollis went quiet. She built the whole story around a question she could not answer. Who was the cab driver, and why was the meter dark? She never found him in time for air. She put out a call instead. The segment ended on the frozen frame, the meter at $0 in the streetlight, and Nia's voice saying that somewhere in city was a man who'd driven a stranger to the hospital in the rain and charged her nothing, and that if anyone knew him, the station would like to say thank you on behalf of a city that mostly forgot to. By Saturday the clip had been shared 11,000 times. By Sunday 40,000. By Monday it had crossed 90,000 and 3 other stations had picked it up. People wrote in the comments about their own dark nights and the strangers who'd carried them. Renee Carter saw it from her hospital bed on Saturday afternoon, holding her 4-day-old daughter, and she cried so hard a nurse came running, and she said, "That's him, that's the man, that's the one who didn't charge me." And a social worker took down what she could and the station ran a follow-up, but still no one had a name, because Terrell Brooks did not watch the local news and did not own a computer, and was that whole weekend, asleep in the daytime and driving at night, entirely unaware that 9 seconds of his life had become the only thing 40,000 strangers wanted to believe about the world. Theodore Banks saw it Friday night, alone, in the kitchen in Bracknell, on the small television he kept for the markets. He had the sound off. He did not need the sound. He saw a pregnant woman bent over a car in the rain. He saw a battered cab pull up. He saw a man get out, and he saw, when the frame froze, the dark meter, and he stood in his kitchen at 11:40 at night with a glass of water going warm in his hand, and he could not breathe. Because he had done that drive. He had done that exact drive 2.33 miles in the rain with a woman in the back seat 36 years before, and he had had everything Terrell Brooks did not have. Money and a good car and a future, and he had lost her, and this nobody with a cracked dashboard and a 9-mop bucket of a car had not lost his. The system. Banks had spent $400 million, and his entire soul building had not put that cab on that corner. A man who would not even turn on his meter. He did not sleep that night, or the next. On the third night, Sunday, against the explicit objection of a security consultant, he paid $4,000 a month to object to exactly this. Theodore Banks drove himself to the east side at 11 p.m., parked the Mercedes on Cedar Avenue across from the storefront where his first clinic had been, now a check-cashing place. And he sat there until his hands began to shake so badly he knew he could not drive home. He got out and stood on the corner in his $1,900 coat in the cold, 71 years old, and he did the thing he had not done since 1988. He lifted his hand at a passing cab. Terrell Brooks pulled to the curb so smooth the old man barely had to step. He read the body at the corner the way he read every body. This is a man in trouble who does not know he is asking for help. He had the back door open before Banks finished reaching for it. Banks gave an address in Bracknell, 11 miles away, the longest fare Terrell would catch all week, and Terrell did not press the meter button at 11:22 that night because the meter was for strangers who could spare it, and whatever this old man in the good coat was carrying, it was not the kind of thing you charge for. The small black box stayed dark at $15, and neither man, for the next 19 minutes and 11 miles, knew who the other was. They drove in silence past Cedar and up Carnegie, and as they came alongside the great glass hospital with the name cut 18 inches into the marble, Banks looked at it through the rain-streaked window and made a sound, low, that was not quite a word. "You all right back there?" Terrell asked. The way he asked everyone, low, no judgment hung on the end of it. And Theodore Banks, who had not told a living soul in 36 years, told a cab driver whose name he did not know, in the dark, with the meter dark, the whole thing. He did not mean to. It came up out of him the way water comes up when the ground can't hold it anymore. He said his wife's name was Eleanor and that she taught 2nd grade and that she was the only person who ever made him laugh. He said she got sick in the night in February of 1988 and the ambulance was 40 minutes out and he drove her himself 2.33 miles and it was not fast enough. He said the baby was a girl. He said, and his voice did not break, which was somehow worse, that he had named her Grace and that he had never said her name out loud, not once in 36 years, and that he had built 4 hospitals so it would never happen to anyone else, and it had worked, it had genuinely worked. The response times were down to 8 minutes, and none of it, not 1 minute of it, had ever felt like enough. Terrell did not interrupt. He did not say he was sorry, because Ola had taught him that sorry is what you say when you want the talking to stop. He did not offer the man a single word of advice or scripture or comfort, because he understood, the way he understood weather, that the old man in the backseat was not asking to be fixed. He was asking to be heard, once by someone who would not flinch. So Terrell drove, slow, in the right lane, and he let the silences sit where they fell. And when Banks finished, Terrell said only the truest thing he had, which was, 36 years is a long time to carry a name you won't set down. And then, because the address was coming up, and because something in the way the old man had said the hospital's name had snagged in him, Terrell glanced at the card bleached white on his dashboard, and he asked the question he never asked his fares. "That's your name on that building back there?" There was a long quiet then from the back. "Yes." Terrell nodded slowly. He pulled into the long drive of a house he could not have afforded the gate of, and he put the car in park, and he turned around in his seat to look at the man directly, which he almost never did, and he said, "Then I owe you a thank you. You built the place my granddaughter's about to be raised near, and a girl I drove last Tuesday had her baby on your 4th floor because the cab got her there in time." He said it plain. He was not trying to land anything. He did not know what he was landing. Banks went very still. "What night?" he said. "Tuesday. Pregnant girl off Kinsman. Wasn't gonna make it on her own." "The meter," Banks's voice had changed. "You didn't run the meter?" "No, sir." "Why?" Terrell looked at him a moment. This old man with everything, asking why a poor man hadn't charged. And he gave the answer Ola gave him, the answer that was not an answer, the only one he had. "Because you don't get paid for the good you do in the dark," he said. "That's how you know it's real." For 11 seconds, Theodore Banks did not move. He sat in the back of a cab in his own driveway, and he did not move for 11 seconds, and then his face came apart. He put both hands over it, this man the magazines called untouchable, this man who had buried 2 partners dry-eyed, and for the first time in 36 years Theodore Banks cried. Not the contained manageable grief he had allowed himself at the very edges of certain nights, the other kind, the kind that comes up from a place that has been sealed so long it has its own weather, the kind that sounds when it finally breaks, less like a man weeping than like a wall coming down, slow then all at once. Terrell did not look away and did not move toward him. He turned the heat up one notch, and he reached up and clicked the dome light off so the man could fall apart in the dark, where it was real, and he waited, both hands on the wheel, the way he had waited for 100 strangers in this same front seat, and he let Theodore Banks cry in the back of a cab with the meter at $0 for as long as it took. What broke in Banks that night was not the grief he'd had all along. What broke was the lie he'd built the grief a building around. For 36 years he's had said it, people fail, systems don't. He had needed it to be true, because if the system was the thing that failed Eleanor, then he could fix it, and he had, and the fixing was supposed to fill the hole, and it never had, not for 1 minute. Because down underneath the marble he had always known the truth and had paid $400 million not to look at it. The truth was that on a night in 1988 it was not a system that drove a brown Buick 2 1/3 miles too slow. It was a man, it was him. He had failed her, the way men fail, being only men. And the thing that finally let him set it down, in the back of that cab, was watching it from the other side. Because a man had also saved Renee Carter. A man with nothing. A man who would not turn on a meter. The same fragile, unreliable, magnificent human being that Banks had spent his life trying to engineer out of the equation, was the only thing that had been on that corner in the rain when it counted. People did not only fail. People also drove through the night for free and did not stay to be thanked. He had built his whole cathedral on half a sentence, and a cab driver had just handed him the other half. When he could speak, Banks took out a checkbook, the way a drowning man reaches for the nearest hard thing, and he wrote a number and tore the check and held it over the seat with a hand that was still shaking. "I want you to have this," he said. "I don't even know your name." Terrell looked at the check. He did not take it. "Terrell Brooks," he said. "And no, sir, I don't take what I haven't earned. I drove you home. That's an 11-mile fare. You can pay me the 11-mile fare and we're square." "This isn't a handout," Banks said, and there was something almost desperate in it now, the rich man's last reflex to make the wound go away with money. "It's a thank you, for her, for the girl." "Then give it to her," Terrell said gently. "She lost a basket of clean clothes and she's got a new baby and $4 on a phone. She earned a thank you. I just did my job with the clock turned off." He folded the old man's hand back around the check, the same motion he'd used on a 19-year-old girl outside a motel, on a deacon with a $20 bill, on everyone who had ever tried to pay him for being a person. "But I'll tell you what I'll take, if you're really asking." "You got 11,000 people work for you," Terrell said. "You got 8-minute ambulances. That's real. What you built. I'm not going to stand here and tell you it ain't. But that girl Tuesday didn't call an ambulance. You know why? Because she did the math. Same math I run all night. She figured a ride she couldn't pay for was a bill they'd take out of her baby. So she stood in the rain instead. Your 8-minute ambulance never had a shot, 'cause she was too scared of the bill to dial it." He let that sit. "There's a whole city out here doing that math, Mr. Banks. Every night. You want to thank somebody? Make it so won't nobody on this side of town ever again be too poor to call for help." The two of them sat in the dark a long time. Then Banks paid the 11-mile fare, 31 v money clip, in cash. And he wrote down Terrell's number on the back of a business card with a hand that had mostly stopped shaking. And Terrell pulled out of the gate and drove back to the east side to finish his night. Because he still had 4 fares to make rent, and a job was a job whether or not it had just cracked a rich man open, like a nut. He did not think much more about it. Men said things in the back of his cab at 1 a.m. and almost never called. Banks called on Tuesday. What he built over the next 14 months, with Terrell Brooks refusing every dollar that wasn't earned, and insisting on every dollar that was not a charity. Banks had tried charity for 36 years. Charity was just the system wearing a kinder coat. This was something else. They called it, after a great deal of argument, the Carey Program, because Terrell would not let them name it anything that sounded like a foundation, and Renee Carter, when they asked her, said the word she kept coming back to was carried. It worked like this. Any person inside the Banks regional coverage area, 11 zip codes across the east side and the inner ring suburbs, who had a medical emergency and could not safely wait or pay for transport, could call a number, day or night, and a vetted driver would come, fast, and take them to care. And there would never be a bill, and there would never be a question, and the meter, by written rule, would stay dark. Banks funded it at $2.4 million a year out of the operating budget, not the foundation, because Terrell had insisted it be a cost of doing business and not an act of generosity, since a thing you can stop being generous about is not safe to depend on. They started with 9 drivers and 3 cars and a single dispatcher working a folding table in a leased room off Cedar that rented for $410 a month. Terrell trained every one of them himself in the front seat of his own cab, 2 ride-alongs each, 6 hours a driver, and the only rule he gave them, the only one, was the rule his grandmother had given him at a kitchen table in 1981. You don't get paid for the good you do in the dark, so do it like nobody's watching, because mostly nobody is. In its first 11 months, the carry program completed 147 rides with a median pickup time of just under 7 minutes. Faster, Banks noted without irony, than the network's own ambulances had managed in 1988. By month 9 they had grown from 9 drivers to 31, from 3 cars to 14, and from 1 folding table to a real dispatch desk staffed around the clock. It is impossible to say how many lives that saved, and Terrell would not let anyone pretend to a number they couldn't stand behind, so the program never published one. But the OB nurses on the 4th floor noticed something by the 8th month. The women were coming in earlier. Not sicker and later, the way the poor always came, having waited until waiting nearly killed them. Earlier, because somewhere out in the dark city a piece of the math had finally changed, and a frightened woman at a curb in the rain no longer had to choose between the help and the bill. Banks also did one other thing quietly, that he did not put in any budget. He drove Terrell himself one Tuesday morning to the free clinic on Quincy, and he sat in the waiting room for 90 minutes in his good coat among people who had no idea who he was, and he paid in cash for Terrell Brooks to finally see Smiz. Okafor and get his eyes checked and his feet checked, and a standing prescription he would no longer skip when rent was close, because Terrell had spent 9 years making sure other people got to care in time, and had been quietly, stubbornly running himself into the same ground he pulled everyone else out of. Terrell argued. Banks said, and it was the only time the old man ever pulled rank, "You said you don't take what you haven't earned. You earned this in 1981 at a kitchen table. I'm just slow paying it." And Terrell for once had no answer, and he let the man do it, and that, more than any check, was the thing that made them, against all sense, friends. There was a wall in the flagship hospital that had stayed blank for 36 years. It was in the lobby of the maternity floor, the floor Banks had never set foot on, a long panel of pale marble that the architects in 1991 had left empty for a donor name that never came, because, every time someone proposed selling it, Banks killed the idea without explaining why. The truth, which he had told no one until a cab driver in the dark, was that he had kept it blank for Eleanor, and for Grace, and could not bear either to leave it empty or to fill it, and so it had stayed for 36 years, a blank wall on a floor he refused to visit, the most extensive silence in Cleveland. On a Tuesday in May, 14 months after the rain, Theodore Banks rode the elevator to the 4th floor for the first time in his life. He went alone. He had a small brass plate in his hand, and a man from facilities with a drill, and till Brooks, who had said he'd come, because the old man had asked him to, and because Terrell understood what it costs a man to walk onto the floor where the worst thing happened, even 36 years late. The plate did not say Banks. The whole building said Banks. The plate, in letters 1.5 inches high, said, "For Eleanor, who taught 2nd grade, and for Grace, who would have been 36. And under that, smaller, the words Terrell's had said in the dark, which Banks had asked if he could borrow, and Terrell had said weren't his to lend, they were his grandmother's, but the old man could have them anyway. "You don't get paid for the good you do in the dark, that's how you know it's real." Banks set the name he had carried for 36 years down on the wall. He stood back from it for a long time, longer than he stood at the gravesides, and he did not cry this time, because the crying was done. He just looked at his wife's name and his daughter's name in the light on the floor where babies are born, and something in his face that had been clenched since 1966, since a boy stood on Hoff Avenue and decided to never again be a man things happened to. Finally, at 72, let go. He was not alone for it after all. Renee Carter came. Terrell had told her about the unveiling, and on the morning of the 2nd Tuesday in May she rode up to the 4th floor with her daughter on her hip, 14 months old now, in a yellow dress, the child who had been born 2 1/3 miles and 1 cab ride from never being born at all. Renee stood with Terrell and the old man and read the 2 names on the wall, Eleanor and Grace, and she understood, in the way mothers understand things without being told, exactly what she was looking at and what it had cost. Her daughter, who had 3 words so far and used all of them at once, reached one fat arm toward the bright brass plate and the light coming off it and said the only word she had for a thing that shines. "Star," the baby said. Nobody corrected her. Theodore Banks looked at the child who was alive because a man had turned off a meter, and he laughed the helpless way Eleanor used to make him laugh, the first time in 36 years he had made that sound, and he said, very quietly, to no one, to all of them, "Yes, all right, Star." Down on Kinsman that same week, a different thing happened, smaller, that no one filmed. A young driver in the carry program, one of the 9 Terrell had trained, picked up a man in a thin coat at 3 a.m. who only needed to go just up the way, and the driver, remembering the only rule, left the meter dark and drove him, and at the end the man said, "You a good man." And the young driver who had heard Terrell tell the story a dozen times said what Terrell had taught him to say, which was, "Get some rest." And the meter, that whole ride, stayed at in dollars. The thing Ola Brooks carried up from Greene County, Alabama, in 1953 wrapped in a church dress so it wouldn't bang, was still moving through the city, from a kitchen table to a cab, to a checkbook to a marble wall to a stranger in a thin coat at 3 a.m., and it had never once asked to be paid, and that, she would have told you, is the only reason it never ran out. Terrell Brooks still drives nights. He turned 56 this year. He could have taken a salary at the program he built, and they offered, more than once, but he said a man should do at least one thing in his life that he can't be fired from, and driving his own cab through his own city in the dark was that thing for him. The scripture card is still taped to the dash, bleached all the way white now, 3 words you can't read anymore, but he knows the rest by heart. And on the nights when the radio's gone quiet and the city's all the way asleep, when a body steps off a curb that's carrying its whole life in 2 plastic bags, Terrell Brooks still pulls over, and still leaves the small black box dark, and still drives them, and still doesn't write it down. Because here is the thing his grandmother knew, that a rich man had to lose everything and spend $400 million and 36 years to learn, and that you already know if you've ever been carried. The person who pulls over for you in the rain, with the clock turned off, when no one is watching and no one will ever know, is not the smallest kind of help in the world. He is the largest. He is the whole thing. The systems matter, the 8-minute ambulances matter, the buildings matter. But underneath all of it, holding it up, is one tired person deciding in the dark for free that you are worth the trip. So here is the question, and it does not have a clean answer, and that is why it is worth asking. Theodore Banks built 4 hospitals and saved thousands of lives because he could not save the one. Terrell Brooks saved one life at a time for free for 9 years and could not have built a hospital if his life depended on it. The world keeps insisting we choose which one is the real kindness. The man who fixes the system, or the man who pulls over in the rain. So tell me, before you scroll on, if you could only build one of them in your lifetime, the hospital or the habit, the system or the stranger, which would you build, and which one would have saved your mother? If this story made you think of someone who once carried you when the meter should have been running, send it to them tonight. They may not know you still remember. There's a line in tonight's story I almost cut 3 times. I'm still not sure I earned the right to keep it. It's the thing Terrell's grandmother tells him at the kitchen table. She says, "You don't get paid for the good you do in the dark. That's how you know it's real." I keep coming back to the dark part. Not the good part, the dark part. The good you do when nobody's counting and nobody will ever know. And I'll be honest with you, I don't always believe it. There's a version of me that wants the credit. That keeps a little tally going. I think most of us keep the tally. The whole story is about a man who just refused to. If you're hearing this somewhere past midnight, after a shift somebody should have thanked you for and didn't, I wrote Terrell for you. Maybe you're the overnight aide on your last hour. Maybe you're the one driving someone to the hospital right now, scared, running the math. I don't know which one you are. The line is for both of you. I'll be back next week with another story about someone the city keeps walking past. Here's the part I can't set down, so I'll leave it with you the way she left it with him. You don't get paid for the good you do in the dark. That's how you know it's real.